Here is part 1 explained in about 1,000 words. Fast-paced, simple English, emotional, mature. And fully YouTube safe. No explicit content. No violence, no hate, no graphic material. Part 1. The walls were too thin. Extended approximately 1,000 words, Mason never thought a fresh start could feel so heavy. When he moved into the old apartment building on the quiet side of Portland, he imagined silence, peaceful evenings, maybe a little loneliness, but the good kind. After his breakup, he didn't want drama, noise, or loud neighbors. He wanted calm. He wanted nights where he could breathe again and mornings where he didn't wake up with someone missing beside him. The apartment was small, a little outdated, and the paint on the hallway walls was beginning to fade, but it felt safe. It felt like somewhere a heart could rest. His first night there, he unpacked only the basic bed pillow. A blanket tan decided he didn't have the energy for anything else. He lay down expecting quiet. The building, however, had other plans. Near midnight, when everything outside was still, a soft sound drifted through the wall to his right. At first, Mason thought he was imagining it. But the sound became clearer. It was the voice of a woman, not laughing, not talking, crying, the kind of quiet crying a person does when they don't want anyone in the world to hear. Soft breaths. Pauses, the kind of small heartbreak that slips out when someone feels safe enough to fall apart. Mason rolled onto his back and stared at the ceiling. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what happened. He only knew her sorrow was so real he could feel it through the wall. He wasn't eavesdropping on purpose. The building was. Old, the walls were thin, and sound traveled whether anyone liked it or not. Still, the noise stayed with him. He didn't know if she was young or older, if she lived alone, if someone had hurt her, or if she simply missed someone she couldn't forget. He only knew she was hurting, and he hated that he could hear it while being unable to help. The next morning, he expected to see her in the hallway when he left for work, maybe carrying groceries or checking mail, maybe looking tired from a night of tears. But the hallway was empty, silent and cold. Kita building felt abandoned, like the walls were the only things alive. That night, he tried to ignore everything. He put on soft music, read for a while, and told himself he needed to mind his own life. But close to midnight, the walls spoke again. He heard the same voice, gentle, emotional, but she wasn't crying this time. She was talking as if on the phone. Her tone was careful, almost hopeful. Like she was trying to convince someone she was okay, even though she wasn't. Mason couldn't understand the words, only the emotion. It was strange how much a tone could tell a story. He realized then that she wasn't just sad, she was broken in a quiet way. The way people only are after they lose something that mattered too much. Mason sat up, listening without meaning to. He felt wrong for hearing her, but he also felt something else, connection. He knew what heartbreak sounded like. Kay knew what long nights felt like. Kay knew how lonely a home could be, even with lights on. By the third night, he found himself almost waiting for the sound. He told himself he wasn't. He told himself he should sleep. Instead, when silence filled the building, he lay awake, wondering if she was okay. But that night, there was nothing, no crying, no talking, just stillness. He should have been relieved, but instead, he worried. When someone cries every night and suddenly stops, it doesn't usually mean they're happy. Sometimes it means the sadness went deeper. On the fourth night, he heard her again, this time only soft humming. It wasn't a song he recognized, just a gentle melody, like something a person does when they're trying not to think too much. Somehow, that small sound calmed him. It made him feel less alone in the building by the end of the week. Mason knew this much. His neighbor was hurting, and he couldn't stop thinking about her. He didn't know her face, didn't know her name. But he knew the sound of her voice better than he knew most people in his life. Part of him wanted to knock on her door and say something simple like, "Hi, I'm next door. You need anything? Just ask." But then he imagined how strange that would sound, how uncomfortable it would feel for her to know a stranger heard her private moments. He didn't want to embarrass her, and he didn't want to seem like someone trying to enter her life without permission. So he stayed silent, respected the wall, even though the wall didn't respect either of them. Still, he found small ways of being someone she couldn't see but might feel. He began playing gentle music at night: piano, guitar, soft songs with no lyrics. Not loud, just enough to be heard through the thin space between them. He didn't know if she noticed, but he hoped she did. A stranger's music was still better than alone in the quiet. On Saturday morning, he finally heard her in the hallway. Her footsteps were light, and she was talking to someone on the phone. He caught a glimpse of her as he opened his door. Brown hair in a loose braid, a sweater hanging off one shoulder, tired eyes that still looked kind. She laughed softly at something the person on the phone said. But the laugh faded quickly, like she remembered she wasn't used to laughing anymore. She passed him without noticing. He didn't say anything, but something in him stirred. She wasn't loud, messy, dramatic, or rude. She carried herself like someone who had been strong for too long and was finally running out of strength that night. He heard her again, this time reading out loud. Sounded like a journal entry or maybe a letter. Her voice was soft, thoughtful, emotional. She talked about wanting a fresh start, about trying to feel normal again, about how hard it was to stop caring about someone who left. Mason closed his eyes and listened, not as a stranger, but as someone who understood every word she said. He knew then that she wasn't just a neighbor, she was a story. And he had walked in during the saddest chapter. Days passed, and Mason learned her patterns. Some nights she was quiet. Some nights she cried. Some nights she talked to herself, encouraging her own heart to heal. The walls made her life impossible to ignore, and the more he heard, the more he cared. But the strange part was this: even though she never spoke to him, even though he never introduced himself, he didn't feel alone anymore. Her presence, her soft voice, her emotional nights reminded him that he wasn't the only one trying to rebuild a life. Pain had put them in neighboring apartments, and the building forced them to share pieces of their hearts without meaning to. Mason wasn't sure what fate was doing. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But deep in his chest, he felt something change. He stopped dreading nights. He stopped thinking about his ex. He stopped feeling like life had ended because next door, behind a thin wall, someone else was trying to survive too. And sometimes knowing someone else is hurting makes healing feel possible. He didn't know it yet, but that thin wall was about to change both of their lives. YouTube safe. No explicit content, no hateful or harmful material. No violence or gore, mature emotional tone. Clean and respectful if you want. I can now. Write Part 2, 1,000 words with the first meeting. Slow romantic tension, deeper character emotions. And a soft cliffhanger. Would you like me to continue? Here is Part 2 explained in approximately 1,000 words. Clean, emotional, fast-paced, simple English. With no explicit or harmful content, fully YouTube-safe. Part 2. The voice he couldn't stop thinking about. Extended approximately 1,000 words. Days passed quietly after Mason first saw the woman from next door. He still didn't know her name, but her voice was a constant part of his nights. Sometimes she wrote in a journal and read her words softly. Sometimes she talked to someone on the phone with a tired but hopeful tone. And sometimes she said nothing at all. Those were the nights that worried him most. Mason tried to focus on his own life. He worked at a small design studio, spent his mornings at a coffee shop, and forced himself to keep busy. But even through routine, he found himself thinking about the woman next door. Not because she was a mystery, but because she felt familiar. Her sadness reminded him of his own. One evening, the weather changed suddenly. The wind grew strong, rain slapped against the windows, and the sky turned dark too early. Mason sat on his couch, listening to the storm, when the lights suddenly went out. The entire building fell into darkness. The hum of electricity stopped, leaving only the sound of the storm. He picked up a small flashlight and stepped into the hallway, expecting to see neighbors checking the situation. But the hallway was empty until a door opened behind him. A soft voice said, "Hi. Sorry, Is the power out everywhere? He turned around and saw her as neighbor. She held a tiny flashlight and a blanket around her shoulders. Her brown hair was tied loosely, and there were faint circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept well in weeks. But her face still looked gentle, warm, and kind. Mason smiled politely. Yeah, looks like the whole building lost power, she nodded, trying to be calm, but her voice held a small shake, like she wasn't comfortable being in the dark alone. I'm Mason, he said, realizing she deserved a name to match the voice he had heard for so long. She hesitated for half a second, then gave a shy smile. I'm Emily. I live next door. Obviously. They shared a small laugh, soft but real. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh without sadness in it. The building was cold, the lights were out, and nothing suggested a normal evening. Yet standing there in the hallway felt strangely safe. They talked about simple things, how old the building was, how the landlord constantly promised repairs, how the storm seemed dramatic for no reason. Their words were basic. But something deeper passed between them, a feeling of quiet understanding. For a few minutes, the hallway didn't feel dark or empty. It felt alive before going back inside. Emily looked at him for a moment longer than needed. There was something fragile in her eyes, something that said she wasn't as okay as she pretended to be. But she thanked him anyway and disappeared into her apartment. Mason went back inside, but sleep didn't come easy. He kept replaying her voice, her tired smile, the way she tried to appear strong. For the first time, she was more than just a voice through a wall. She was real. The next night, the power returned, but the building felt different. The wall between them felt thinner than ever, not because of sound, but because now there was a face behind the voice. Mason found himself listening, again not out of curiosity, but concern. He heard quiet footsteps, a short sigh, and the soft turning of pages. She was reading again, probably writing too. He placed his headphones aside, turned off the music, and let silence fill the room. But there was something he didn't expect silence from her room, too. No crying, no whispered phone calls, no journal pages turning. For someone who always made small sounds, silence became louder than noise. Another day passed. Still nothing. Mason wondered if she was out of town or simply sleeping early. But on the third night, he heard her finally soft crying again, just like the first night. Quiet, careful, almost hidden. The sound pulled at his chest. He wanted to go to her door, knock, ask if everything was okay. But he stayed where he was because he knew that sometimes people need space before they need help. Later that week, he saw her again, this time outside the building, struggling with a box of groceries. Without thinking, he walked over and said, "Let me help." She looked surprised, then grateful. "Thank you. It's heavier than it looked." He carried the box up the stairs while she walked beside him. She wasn't talking much, but her presence felt calm. When they reached her door, she took a breath, almost as if she wanted to say something but was scared to start. "You're very kind," she said softly. "It's nothing," Mason replied. "We're neighbors. That's what people do." That line made her smile, made a forced smile, but a real warm one. After he set the box down, there was a moment where neither of them moved. It wasn't awkward. It was quiet, thoughtful. Emily finally opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she whispered, "Good night," and gently closed the door. Mason returned to his apartment and leaned against the wall they shared. He didn't know why she was hurting. He didn't know who she lost, or why she cried at night, or why she tried to be strong in daylight. But every moment near her made something inside him wake up, a feeling he thought had disappeared when his last relationship fell apart. The next evening brought another storm. Rain hit the windows again, though the power stayed on this time. Around midnight, Mason heard a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, Emily stood there, holding her sweater tightly around herself. I know this is strange," she said quietly, "but I didn't want to be alone tonight. The storm is just too much." Mason stepped aside, letting her in without any questions. He offered her tea, and she sat on his couch, knees tucked close, eyes watching the rain outside, They talked for hours, not about pain, but about life. She told him she worked at a small floral shop. She loved winter and old movies. She hated sleeping in silence. She missed the feeling of safety, the kind where you don't have to think before you breathe. Mason listened with patience. He told her about his job, his love for music, and how he ended up in this old apartment building. For the first time in months, he felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of his life alone. She didn't pry, she didn't judge, she just listened as the storm softened. Her voice grew quieter. "I used to talk to someone every night," she whispered. "Someone who made me feel safe. But one day, they left without a reason. So I talk to the walls now." "I guess that sounds strange." "It doesn't," Mason replied. "Everyone talks to something when they're hurting." Emily's eyes filled with emotion, not tears, just honesty. "I'm trying to heal. I just don't know how." "You don't have to know," Mason said gently. "You just have to keep going." The room fell into quiet comfort. She leaned her head on the back of the couch, not crying, not shaking, just breathing normally again. Before she left, she looked around his apartment and smiled softly. "You play music every night," she said. "Sometimes I think it keeps me from feeling completely alone." Mason didn't realize she had heard it. He wasn't trying to send her comfort, but he had. That small discovery made his chest feel warm. Emily walked to the door and paused. "Thank you for letting me sit here. I didn't expect kindness." "You never have to ask," he replied. She gave a shy nod and stepped into the hallway. Her steps softer than before, her shoulders lighter, her voice no longer trembling. When the door closed, Mason sat in the silence. But this silence felt different. It felt hopeful. He didn't know what their future would hold. He didn't know if she would ever let someone close to her again. But he knew she came to him because something inside her trusted him. Even a little. That was enough for now. The wall between them was still thin, but maybe fate wanted it that way. Clean, emotional, romantic tension without explicit content. YouTube, safe, mature. Simple language. Would you like part 3 extended in 1,000 words with a deeper emotional connection, a meaningful turning point, and a gentle romantic path? Here is part 3 explained in approximately 1,000 words. Fast-paced, emotional, simple English. Completely YouTube safe. No explicit content, no violence, no hate. Nothing graphic. Closing parenthesis. Part 3, the night everything changed. Extended approximately 1,000 words after the night of the storm. Something quietly shifted between Mason and Emily. They didn't suddenly become close, but the air around them felt different. When they passed each other in the hallway, they exchanged small smiles instead of walking by like strangers. When Mason played soft music, Emily didn't turn up her TV. Instead, she let the music drift through the wall. It was their unspoken language, quiet, gentle, careful. Even though life felt a little lighter, the healing wasn't finished. Some nights, Mason heard her crying again, but not as often and not as long. She still carried pain, but it no longer sounded like she was drowning in it. Her voice had moments of strength, moments of hope. One evening, Mason returned from work later than usual. As he walked down the hallway, he heard someone outside the building door. When he opened it, he saw Emily sitting on the front steps, hugging her knees. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. She looked lost in thought, not crying, just tired. Mason sat beside her without asking if she wanted company. She didn't move away, which felt like permission. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, but her voice was quiet. "I thought I was doing better. Then today, someone mentioned him by accident, and it felt like the past came rushing back." She didn't say the man's name, but she didn't need to. Mason understood. "You don't have to be over something just because time passed," he said. "Healing isn't a straight line." Emily turned her head toward him and smiled sadly. "Why are you always so calm?" "I'm not," Mason answered. "I just hide it well." She let out a small laugh. Not a loud one, but a real one. For a moment, they watched the sky without speaking. Their silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. Days later, something unexpected happened. Late at night, around midnight, Mason heard a gentle knock on his door again. When he opened it, Emily stood there with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was messy from sleep and her eyes were soft but uncertain. "I know it's late," she said, "but I didn't want to be alone tonight." Mason didn't hesitate. He moved aside and let her in. She sat on the same couch as before, hugging a pillow close to her chest. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from emotion she didn't know how to hold. "Bad night?" he asked. She nodded. "I had a dream." "Not a nightmare. Just memories. Sometimes that's worse." Mason sat across from her, close enough for her to feel safe, but not so close that she felt crowded. Emily breathed slowly, trying to steady herself. "I don't want to keep bothering you," she whispered. "I don't want to be a problem." "You're not," Mason said gently. "You're just someone who needs a place to breathe." Something in that line softened her completely. Her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time she looked at him without walls around her heart. They talked for hours. She told him how her relationship ended, no arguments, no warnings. One day, the person she trusted most simply decided he didn't love her anymore. It left her with questions she could never answer, and memories she couldn't forget. Mason didn't try to fix it. He didn't say she was better off or that everything would be okay. He simply listened, the way someone listens when they care deeply. When she finally ran out of words, she leaned her head back against the couch and closed her eyes. Not asleep, just resting. Mason watched her quietly. She looked stronger than she believed she was. After a long silence, Emily opened her eyes and looked at him. "Why do you always make me feel safe?" Mason felt something move inside him, something warm, something honest. "Because I know what it's like to lose yourself, and I don't want you to feel alone while you find your way back." Emily's eyes softened. For once, she didn't hide the emotion on her face. She didn't wipe her tears, she didn't pretend to be fine, she didn't apologize for feeling. She just let herself be human. The room stayed quiet for a while. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just quiet. When the morning light slowly crept through the window, Emily looked around the room like she was seeing it in daylight for the first time. Her voice was soft but steady. "Thank you, Mason. I really mean it." He nodded. "Anytime." She stood near the door, ready to leave, but before she opened it, she turned back. "Maybe thin walls aren't always a bad thing," she said with a small smile. When the door closed, Mason felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not because they were suddenly in love, not because something dramatic happened, but because healing had begun on both sides of the wall. After that night, things changed quietly, but clearly. Emily started leaving small things at his door, fresh muffins from the bakery near her shop. A little thank you note, flowers left in a glass bottle. Mason never made a big deal of it. He just smiled and accepted the kindness the way she accepted his. Some nights, she came over just to talk. Not about sadness, any more about life, childhood memories, funny stories from her job. Favorite books, places she wanted to travel. Her voice slowly regained its light. Over time, the thin wall didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a bridge. One evening, after a long winter day, Emily knocked on Mason's door again. This time she wasn't upset. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She simply said, "Come with me for a walk." Her voice was steady, confident, and warm. They walked through the quiet streets, snow on the ground, streetlights glowing on the sidewalk. She told him she was learning to trust herself again. She didn't promise she was healed. She didn't have to. Healing was happening moment by moment. Halfway through the walk, she stopped and looked at him. No fear, no hesitation. "I thought my story was over," she said. "But maybe it's just changing chapters." Mason smiled. "Maybe." Emily looked up at the sky, a sky full of stars. Clear and bright, and she breathed deeper than she had in months. When they returned home, she paused outside her door. "Good night, Mason," he answered softly. "Good night, Emily." The door closed. But, for once, the wall between them felt strong, not because it kept them apart, but because it had brought them together. Later that night, as Mason lay in bed, he heard something through the wall again. Not crying. Not silence, laughter, gentle, real. Full, and he realized something important. She wasn't healing because of him. She was healing because she found her own strength again. He was just a person who sat with her in the dark until she could find her. Light. Their story wasn't about rescuing each other. It was about holding space for someone until they learned to stand again. And sometimes that is love in its purest form, completely YouTube safe. Emotional, romantic, clean. No explicit content or graphic scenes. Strong, ending with hope and meaning. Would you like a part 4, maybe where their friendship slowly turns into gentle, mature love? Or do you want thumbnail text, description, and YouTube titles for this story?